folks, welcome to another Besides the Norm podcast. My name is Stephen. We have Craig on the other side of the table. You can't get any more radio voice than that, the intro.
That's true.
We also have on the line Bruce Henderson from Renew Scotland. How are you doing, Bruce?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Fantastic. Do you like the radio voice, or do you hate that kind of sound?
I think most people don't really like their own voice when they hear it on radio or recorded or whatever. Unfortunately, you know, if you're in politics or you do acting or radio or whatever, you have to listen to your voice anyway.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. So, you represent Renew Scotland now. You know a bit more about Renew Scotland, Craig, than me.
Do you want to start that again?
Yes. really awful there. So, actually, you know what we'll do? We'll start off with the usual question we usually start with. We'll go and try and talk about your childhood. So, how was your childhood, Bruce? And like, where did you grow up and all that kind of thing?
My childhood was quite a long time ago.
Right.
I guess it would come under the heading of okay. It could have been better. It could have been a lot worse, I guess. Born in Edinburgh, initially raised in Tirficcan, West Lothian, moved to Edinburgh. Spent 6 months of my life living in Johannesburg in South Africa. Went to school there. Coming from Scotland, that was really odd because people had different buses in the middle of apartheid. Came back to live in Edinburgh. Went to South Morningside primary school when I came back. Boroughmuir in Edinburgh. Left school to be an apprentice telephone engineer. I got to climb telephone poles and run cables and all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then realised that was kind of all there was. And I kind of wanted something a bit more. I was a union rep at the time as well, and ended up going into the voluntary sector and spent most of my adult life in the voluntary sector with a few kind of wee projects with private sector and public sector organisations, including Scottish Enterprise for a wee while, and then realised that it's a very uncreative place to be. And they also like to spend money. Coming from the voluntary sector, being able to spend money quite so freely was a bit of a shock to the system, I think.
Mm-hmm. If I could just go back as well, like usually we like to ask, what was the first sort of initial spark that got you into politics? Do you remember anything that happened, like maybe in your teens or something like that, or younger?
Yeah, I mean, when I was 16, I was the secretary of the Edinburgh branch of the Campaign for the Scottish Assembly. I've always been passionate about a Scottish Assembly or Scottish Parliament. Not so much on the independent side, but certainly having that devolved capacity. And the SDP came along way back in the 1980s, and I joined the SDP because I've always had an interest in politics, even in my kind of school years. And there really wasn't a party that I kind of looked at and going, oh yes, they're for me. The quality of politicians was maybe a bit better back then, but the tendency for politicians to be less than honest was still prevalent back then as well. Right. And when the SDP went, I left politics and just became a kind of frustrated, angry young man, and then grew into an angry old man. Until Renew came along, and I came back into politics because I thought, here's a group who aren't part of the kind of political bubble and really wanted to do something different, make politics different. And so I kind of got back involved in politics in the last 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things that sort of made Renew interesting for me, was the fact that you didn't appeal to politicians, you appealed to, like, when it came to standing candidates, you didn't try and appeal to getting politicians who want to be politicians standing. You wanted ordinary people standing for ordinary things.
Yep, absolutely. And I think I'm probably the only person who's been a member of a political party, I think, who's standing. Peter Morton, who's standing over in west of Scotland, has stood as an independent for the last few years. And we actually saw an awful lot of commonality between what Peter was standing for and what we were standing for. And it's a very good conversation, and Peter joined our group and has been a very supportive part of the team and a very good addition. And essentially, we are independently minded people. We're not in this to pursue a party line. We're not going to operate a three-line whip. All the other parties do. We take the view that our constituents come first, then our country, and then our party. I think too much of politics is about party comes first. And if there's a bit of time, the constituents and the country. And I think it's about changing politics back to the idea that it should really be about the people rather than the party.
Yeah, this is why I'm not a huge fan of sort of party politics and party democracy the way it is laid out now. There's a few countries, I couldn't give examples, but I know there are countries that exist where they have certain sections of elections where they don't have political parties, they just have people standing. The parties might exist as a background organisation, but you're not voting for parties, you're voting for people, and the party
I like that idea.
It's not even mentioned. And that's kind of a system that I would quite like, because parties tend to, as you say, they tend to drown out constituent issues and individual thought, and it's just, here's the party line, stick to it or leave.
I think that's right. I mean, if you have a debate in the Scottish Parliament, for example, on a key issue, you already know the results before they go in because they'll vote down party lines. So the question of why you have a debate where essentially all we're going to do is stand up and regurgitate their party policy is a bit pointless.
Yeah.
If you had independently minded people, and one of the things I should have said when you asked me about the politics side, I did actually get involved in politics a little bit, but I didn't see it as being involved in politics as such. I campaigned with Margaret Mcdonald when she was an independent candidate for, I think, 3 elections. Largely because here's a lady amazing lady in her own right, a very good sense of humour, but she was standing up for what she believed was right.
Yeah.
And she wasn't towing a party line. She had particular views. I didn't agree with all of them. But I would rather have a few more Margaret McDonalds in the Parliament and mix it up a bit than have a lot of people who just do as they're told.
So just to be clear, Margaret McDonald is the ex-SNP independent. She left or was kicked out of the SNP, I think. I can't remember which one. That's what you're talking about, right?
She upset the leadership, and so they bumped her down the list. And she said, well, tough. I'm not going to take that. And so she stood in her own right. And at least one of the elections, she got enough votes to have a second Margaret McDonald elected. Unfortunately, she was the only one on her list.
Yeah. And that must have been... The person that got elected because there was only one of her must have been thrilled. She was. No, but she was quite radical. Was she not quite a bit of a lefty? Was she not quite into radical politics?
There were areas where she, not being part of a political party, she was able to take the shackles off. So, for example, one of the areas that she had a very keen interest in was people being able to die with dignity, because and she spent a lot of time researching that and talking to people, and she had a very clear view that there's a point where people should have some right to determine if they're going to die a horrible death.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't they have some right in terms of, and obviously not just, I'll sign a bit of paper, there are safeguards and all sorts of things in there. She also took a great deal of interest in helping prostitutes in Leith. Yeah. I don't mean by promoting them, but there was a prostitute education project which was about helping to support prostitutes essentially, these were things that were regarded as quite controversial, but it illustrates having an independently minded person means that we actually start engaging with issues that we maybe pretend we don't really need to do anything about, but actually we should be, and I think it's that level of not so much controversy. I think it's only controversial because it's not in the political bubble.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But these are issues that you still need to recognise. You can't just ignore these things. You actually have to do something about it. And Margot then took it on, and obviously you had the whole thing about the Scottish Parliament building and the cost overruns, and the fact that no one was ever held accountable for a building that cost 11 times the original cost, which is a massive overspend.
Yeah.
And Margot was the one who kept going on the case.
So you were talking a bit about Margot's views on dying with dignity and dealing with prostitutes. I guess would they be things that Renew would be in support of as well? Similar things that Margot was pushing, or has there been a change since then for you at least?
No, I mean, to be fair, I haven't really thought about these issues for since Margot was about. It's not something we've taken a position on as Renew Scotland. I think it is. These are things, and there are probably other ones as well, which we may come across as we talk, where we should be thinking through, what we do, because where there are challenges that exist, and poverty is a good one. The other parties aren't talking about ending poverty. It's never been on the Labour Party's agenda. It's never been something that the Greens have argued. It's never been something really the Liberal Democrats have pushed, and the Conservatives seem to like having poor people, but that's another matter. That's another one where we should be looking at how we end poverty, stop making allowances. We can make a massive difference to people's lives and to our economy and to our communities with that one single, direction is end poverty. Make government have an absolute obligation to ensure a basic, decent quality of life for all its people. And there are some wonderful examples of how you can look at things like debt poverty. There are some quite ambitious examples when you tie in climate change with ending fuel poverty, and these kind of things. But, it's being able to get outside of the political bubble and start to look at it from a kind of fresh perspective, if you like. Because I think the problem is when you're in the political bubble, you only see what's in the political bubble. And we need to kind of burst it a wee bit and change the air, I guess. And things like prostitution, things like dying with dignity are things that fall into that category of things, of areas that we should really be a bit clearer about. We should try and identify what is our long-term view on these things. Because they're not going to go away, they're here. And people live longer, which means that people are going to have those kind of more debilitating issues as they get older. We're talking on a day when Prince Philip has died. So we're kind of he died at 99 years old. It's almost symbolic of the fact that people live longer and will have mobility issues, sensory issues, chronic diseases and things that they wouldn't have had if we were back maybe 30 or 40 years ago when people died younger.
Yeah. I was just thinking, on the sort of idea of getting rid of poverty, what about UBI and stuff like that? Do you believe that would go in some way to help?
Absolutely. And in the 1980s, the Social Democrats actually had a proposal which was called personal allowance, which is essentially the same as UBI. So UBI is not new. It just had a different name in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And the only party that was pursuing it was Social Democrats. And then the Liberals joined in the alliance. And when the Liberals became Liberal Democrats, they kind of dropped the whole ending poverty idea. So we have had this back in the 1980s. UBI, as it's now called, is now becoming a kind of catchword for helping. People aren't seeing it as a way of ending poverty, they're seeing a way of changing it. I think UBI is one of a number of tools that we can use to end poverty, and I think it is something that we do need to introduce. Mm-hmm. But we need to go much further, because debt poverty is not going to be solved by UBI. It might help, but it's certainly not going to solve. And debt poverty is one of the most damaging things, because if you're someone who's almost permanently in debt for the whole of your life, and there's almost no way in which you can see that you can actually pay it off other than winning the lottery, then that's hugely stressful. It is a huge, huge burden on someone, and it's something that we need to address. South Korea had a very interesting way of dealing with this. They had something called the Happy Fund. It's a brilliant idea. And what they decided was that anyone who had debt up to about $10,000, that was long-term debt, and they could demonstrate that they had tried hard to pay it off, could actually get it paid off from the Happy Fund. Mm-hmm. And what that did was, all these tens of thousands or however many people that were affected were able to effectively have a fresh start. And so instead of having this permanent debt and this complete inability to have any money to spend other than on very, very, very basics, they suddenly had a little bit more money. They could spend more money in the supermarket. They could actually go and enjoy life a bit more. So they actually stimulated the economy at a very local level. It changed their lives in terms of taking the stress and pressure off, which also improved their health, physical and mental. Mm-hmm. And it meant that this wasn't something that was a permanent feature. They could go on and enjoy their life, have a better quality of life. And it's interesting also, if you look at New Zealand are now talking about quality of life as a way of measuring success of the government. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we're proposing here, is that we should have an absolute obligation by government to ensure a basic, decent quality of life. And that should be part of the measure of how successful government is. Because if it's not looking after the needs of its people, what's it for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the current measurement is almost irrelevant most of the time. GDP goes up and people get poorer in real terms. It kind of doesn't mean anything anymore.
Imagine trying to help people out and then like everything like turns out to be a lot better in life. Imagine that.
It'd be weird, eh?
Mm-hmm. Craziness.
A silly idea.
Yeah. But there's some interesting. There's some interesting examples around the world of how people have tackled some of these things. And what we need to do is persuade other people to join us and look at a longer-term strategy, because it's probably a 20 or 30-year project. So everyone needs to kind of sign up to it. But strand by strand and adjusting the way that government works at all levels can, I believe, actually end poverty, and poverty can be part of our history. And I think that would be a brilliant place to be.
Mm-hmm. So have you heard of, I would imagine you might have, Andrew Yang?
Off the top of my head, it just ring a bell.
So Andrew Yang was one of the presidential candidates in 2020, and his ideas sort of remind me of the way you're talking right now. It sounds like you would sort of be on the same terms as Andrew Yang. His thing, he's got his own term. It's I think it's human-centered capitalism, where he supports like sort of startup companies, and then they help inject funds into the economy to then fund this quote-unquote human-centered capitalism, where he supports things like either UBI or negative income tax, where people are guaranteed funds, and there's things to sort of limit how bad student loan debt can be, and how, I mean, general debt as well. And that sounds like along the same lines as you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'll certainly go and have a look at them after we've had our conversation, because I think it's one of these things. If we genuinely want people to have a decent life, then you have to tackle poverty. You can claim you're going to close the educational attainment gap till you're blue in the face. It's never, ever going to happen unless you actually end poverty. It simply won't. And it's unrealistic to promise that you're going to close the educational attainment gap in any meaningful way unless you actually end poverty. And I think that's the problem about the political bubble that we have here in Scotland and indeed in the UK generally, is that politicians live in this little fantasy world that says, if we promise this and we throw some money in there, that'll sort it and we'll be fine for another few years. And then we'll just come up with a different solution that will involve doing a bit of tinkering and throwing some more money at it. If we keep just doing that, then we'll keep getting elected and everything will be fine. The problem is the political bubble doesn't actually solve the problems.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do, is actually change that round so that we become problem solvers rather than just looking at political survival election to election.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of people like to separate social politics and economic politics, and I think that's wrong. I think they're linked in very many ways. I can't remember if you said it before we started recording or after, but you were talking about ending poverty and how ending poverty on its own would start to help on these health issues, and then you would automatically start lowering drug issues, since a lot of drug issues are caused by poverty and stress and things like that. And it would automatically start solving these other issues as well. Not completely solving them, but it would go a long way better than just trying to add in extra policies without focusing on this sort of main cause.
That's absolutely right. And, addiction poverty is one of the worst as well, because once you get stuck into it, it's really difficult for people to come out of that addiction. And one of the addictions is drugs. Another addiction is gambling. And there are other addictions around about that as well, where it's a kind of escape from what people have in terms of their life. And unless you change that environment that people are in, that just gets worse and worse and worse. And it does, I've seen some figures around UBI itself in terms of the number of babies that are born with that are healthier and larger. At the moment, people who live in poverty, a lot of people have underweight babies. We have one of the highest death rates, suicide rates, for young men in Europe. And that's partly due to isolation, it's partly due to poverty. And those two things go hand in hand as well, poverty and isolation. Again, if you actually ended poverty, people would have a much better quality of life and they would engage much more with other people. And you can actually reduce the isolation. But it's well reminded, and it is, and it's one of the frustrations I've had all my life working in communities around Scotland, is seeing people working hard day after day, and some of them are struggling every single day. They don't have a day off. There isn't a single day they aren't challenged, they aren't struggling, they aren't trying to get by. And we need to change that. And this may be my last opportunity to try and push for that and change it. I'm not looking to be a career as a politician. I don't see in my 50s that I'm going to have a long career as a politician. But if what I can do, and what we can do as a group, is to get the other parties and the other people and to come together and go, you know what, we should do this, then we will have achieved, I guess, a kind of big step forward, a step change, if you like.
So you mentioned the isolation there, and it just reminded me that we've interviewed, I think you're the 10th candidate we've interviewed.
9th, it'll be, aye.
I think you're like 6th this week, so there's been a lot of people we spoke to this week.
Been busy.
And we've not spoken about lockdowns and limitations and
we've
things
kind of shied away from that
time.
for some reason, aye.
I think we've been too focused on post-election, and we've not talked about what's happening now. What's your view or Renew's view on the current situation and lockdowns and the concept of them and things like that?
Well, let's treat these things to some extent separately. Isolation itself was an issue before COVID came along. We have a lot more people living longer, and I think I'm right in saying we have the highest number of older single people, because partners have died, than ever before. I remember working at a group in Worcester Hales, and the chairman at the time there, a chap called Bob Brooksbank, a real gent, he said that one of the biggest killers for older people will be isolation, and I believe he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So isolation itself is a big issue, and we need to look at ways in which we change that. Part of that is about people having the resource to be able to go out. Because one of the reasons people are isolated is because they can't afford to go out, and therefore they cut themselves off, and it becomes harder and harder to go out. And it's something I've noticed in the course of the last year. I've actually noticed I've kind of developed a kind of agoraphobic thing, where because all I was doing at one point was going out to go to the shop, the local supermarket, and back. And even I've suffered to some extent from that isolation. And when we unlock, we can't all rush together. We're still going to have to, in my opinion, be a bit cautious about how we open out, because everyone's at different levels in terms of vaccinations. There are other variants which we're aware of. Doesn't necessarily mean they're here in Scotland, but we know they exist, which we're less certain about. Some of those variants do affect children, and we're now talking about vaccinating our younger people. I think the Pfizer vaccine has been tested on youngsters as young as 12.
Yeah,
so there's an expectation. So that isolation is going to be with us still for a little while from before COVID, and we're going to have the additional isolation that we've had with COVID. And isolation is a huge issue insofar as people are the group animals. I'm not saying we're hunting packs, so it's about to say that, trying to avoid that, but we do. We like that engagement. We like to talk to people. We like to hold hands. We like to just engage. It's part of who we are. And I think it's one of the things which we need to probably look to the voluntary sector, partly look to befriending type groups, partly look to ourselves looking out for our neighbours. I've at least been able to engage with my neighbours, and that's been good. But I don't think there isn't a single route that you go that says that's going to solve it. But isolation, I think, is a big issue insofar as it was big before COVID, but it's more significant, I think, as we come out of COVID.
Have you heard of the men's shed movement?
Oh, just about to bring that up.
Yeah, so we like to bring this up occasionally, that we live in a town called Kennewy, and we actually have, I think, the biggest in terms of membership men's shed in Kennewy, and in Scotland. Obviously, it's the biggest it's only in Kennewy. And that does a hell of a lot of good, partly because of the person who runs it. He just never stops. He never shuts up. He never stops speaking to you. He's always talking about it. And it's brilliant because he gets loads of fun. Obviously, COVID's kind of messed up this year. But, they're open twice a week. They've got a big workshop. They've got a big cool workshop. They've got a bunch of arts and crafts stuff, and you can pretty much do what you like. There's like 60 or 70 people coming on Tuesday, 60 or 70 people coming on Friday. It's a fantastic thing, and I think there should be one in every single town because it seems to have helped a ton of people.
I think they're getting there as well. They're getting quite close to that because there's like new ones opened in Glenrothes, Kirkcaldy. I don't know, like what area are you from, Bruce? Where are you from?
Well, I live in Dunfermline at the moment, but I actually worked with Clear in Buckhaven for 4 years. Yeah, and the men's shed movement, I have a very strong passion for what Clear does. It's one of those organisations that is very community driven. It is a group that kind of looks at things and says, look, there's a gap here. How do we make a difference? And there's a kind of similar idea in terms of the pallet workshop that Colin Pentland runs for Clear, where they take pallets and convert them into garden furniture, planters, all sorts of things, bike workshop. And it's the same idea of bringing people together to do some very practical things, but it's the banter and the engagement in between that actually makes the difference with it. And yeah, I'm very well aware of the men's shed movement. I think it's really good. The one in Buckhaven sometimes includes ladies as well.
Yeah, the Kennewy one's the same. Yeah,
I think that's community shed.
That's part of the reason the membership's so high.
Yeah,
there's a lot more women there.
That was actually one of the main. So I was actually standing in the council elections at this time, and I went up as part of that campaign to go up and sort of see what was going on in the community and stuff like that. So I was at the first meeting, and that was one of the main things that was talked about was the men's shed bit. And instantly it was said, nope, community shed, we want men and women in. So that was cool.
Women fighting for that shit as well. It was awesome. I knew, like, we've been going up so often that, like, your dad's up there, everybody's up there, and it's great for the audience. And youngins.
Yeah.
Youngins.
Weirdly said.
I think the key thing is that every community needs a community focus. Clear provides that community focus to a large extent in Buckhaven and to some extent in Methil with the growing spaces and the various volunteering activities. The main shed in Kennewy, and I lived in Kennewy for a while as well, main shed is kind of clear community focal point where people are able to come together and do very practical and very positive things. And I think it's having those kind of projects that adapt to the specific area. So, they're not all the same, they're not identical. They actually evolve around the people that are engaged in the actual development of it, and everyone who comes in adds something new to it, but it's creating that focal point where people can come together and use their skills and their knowledge, but it's the engagement that people have while they're doing this that adds huge value.
Yeah. So let's reverse back a little bit. Okay. You said you lived in Kennewy for a little while.
All right.
I've been around. No. There's a housing development up at the top end of Kennewy.
Oh, the rich bit.
And this is a few. Pardon?
The rich bit of Kennewy.
The rich bit of Kennewy.
If there is such a thing, it's there.
I guess it could be. I know Kennewy is fairly varied, and then as it runs into Windigate, that changes again.
Mm-hmm.
But my partner and I had kind of got together, and apparently you have to live in a house that neither of you have lived in and whatever. So we actually managed to get a job where we lived in a brand new house for a year, looking after a private housing development. And this was the height of the recession as well. It was a very good deal, and it was very good. The guy who owned this in his 70s and was a bit... I'm trying to be diplomatic now. He wasn't someone who was easy to get on with. Let's leave it at that, okay?
It was for Kennewy.
So it was for Kennewy, that's what you're trying to say, Bruce.
Well, he was actually from Blackburn in Lancashire. And what he was doing was buying up partial developments where the developer was unable to continue because he was cash rich. He'd buy them up, change them, and then progress them. And so he would buy them cheap, basically. But not long after we left, he was actually prosecuted, not for the first time by the Health and Safety Executive, for having one of these workmen in the bucket on a digger high up to the first floor with no helmets or anything. And someone took a picture. Yes. Anyway, it was an interesting experience. I liked Kennewy, to be fair. Very easy to get around and very good chip shop.
I will agree with you right there. Yes, the Little Friars, the free advertising for the Little Friars. Shout out to the Little Friar there.
Oh, but Ramsans, you like Ramsans? Ramsans has got the best pizza in the world.
Arguably, yes.
I generally don't go to chip shops for pizza.
Oh, it's not a chip shop, it's
an Indian place, this one.
You get pizza for the Indian.
All right, no, I've not. I tend to think that Italian places are the place to go for pizza.
I don't know any Italian places.
Well, this is the issue.
Actually, the chip shop is Italian. It's an Italian guy that runs it now.
They actually done pizza for a short while as well, which is amazingly like Italian, Turkish, Indian. They all seem to sell exactly the same stuff, which is quite a common theme.
Yeah,
especially around just in Scotland really as a whole.
In towns like Kennedy, though, it seems to be the most common thing.
Ah, yeah. There you go. Right, anyway.
Right, so
we'll go off Kenway-based
food. I can't believe we started talking about Little Fryer.
So, do you have any sort of like proper local policies that you would like to go over? Like we spoke to
free chippies for everybody.
We spoke to somebody the other day talking about the local train station. You've got such things as like the Leavenmouth rail link and stuff like that. Yeah. Do you have anything you're sort of like wanting to put forward?
Where do you start? I mean, the Leaven Rail link, absolutely. And Alan Armstrong, who's one of the key campaigners for the Leaven Rail link, is also one of the founders of Clear. So obviously has quite a good level of knowledge on this one. It seems like a no-brainer. Yeah. You know, put a rail link in and you significantly increase people's ability to travel. And if you're looking at travelling to work and getting jobs and things, then a rail connection is essential. Leaven High Street has gone through a fairly difficult phase over the last few years. Methil and Buckhaven. Buckhaven has the poorest data zone in the whole of Fife. So these are areas that really could do with a significant economic boost. And we've had BiFab, of course, go just there at Methil Docks. So absolutely, I think the rail link there is. I mean, they should start doing it tomorrow. The route exists.
Yeah.
Just get on with it. I cannot understand why it's taken so long for the powers that be to say, let's just go ahead with it. It couldn't be simpler. Mm-hmm. There's a suggestion of a rail link also from Lookers into St Andrews. I think that's more complicated because St Andrews is such a historic place. But I think because if you were going to build a kind of transport network, my view would be you build it round rail. And ideally, you'd want to make it as environmentally friendly as possible. And if you look at Germany, for example, southern Germany are building hydrogen trains. So they're not even going to have cables and things. In Australia, they're doing trains with solar and charging points at each station and so on. So, there's stuff we can do there. One of my bugbears about Kirkcaldy has always been that people complain about the high streets dying. I think one of the things we have to recognise is that the high street left the high street 20, 30 years ago when we started doing retail parks on the edge of town because it's free parking. You can get clothes, you can get food, you can get hardware supplies, you can get stationery supplies and everything. All the stuff we used to get on the high street. And I think the reality is we have to change our thinking about how the high streets work. The only exception, of course, to that is actually St Andrews because they seem to have a reasonably vibrant local economy. But that's partly through golf and it's partly through the university. So I think one of the things we need to do is rethink how we evolve the high streets and stop trying to pretend that we can have the high streets that we had 20 or 30, 40, 50 years ago. Because we're not ever going to have that again. Let's be realistic about it. And let's stop trying to throw money into something that's never going to happen. So part of that is looking at some of the retail accommodation that maybe was residential at one point, got converted to retail, or got converted to offices, put it back to residential accommodation. So at least you have more people living around the high street and therefore more passing trade for those shops that are there. Let's look at things that are a bit more touristy. We've got a good tourist thing going. So Dunfermline, for example, you've got Pittentree Park Gate, and you've got this wonderful stretch up to the high street. There's a lot of history and stuff there. So we could do some stuff there. When we come to Kirkcaldy, one of the things which I think is only really being recognised now is that Kirkcaldy has this fantastic waterfront space.
Yeah. And
what I cannot comprehend is overlooking this amazing waterfront along the promenade are multi-storey car parks a swimming pool where basically you're indoors.
Yep.
It should be swimming with flats and hotels and restaurants and so on, overlooking the water and connecting the water to that high street, so that what you actually have is quite a vibrant space where you've got more people living there, but you're actually harnessing the waterfront, and perhaps looking at how you harness the waterfront as well. I know in Leven, for example, there are some councillors who are talking about having a pier with a kind of big whale thing on it and so on. Not so sure about the whale thing. Pier sounds interesting. Well, I'm never quite sure about these kind of things. The pier sounds a more practical thing. Yeah. I think, yes, it might attract people. The whale might attract people too, but I look at the cost and think, is there a real value to that? Mm-hmm. The advantage Leven has is it's got a nice sandy beach, which used to extend all the way along to Buckhaven and the Bray. Buckhaven and Methil used to be holiday destinations years and years ago. Which, when you look at it today, you think, really? Yeah. But it was. Yeah. They actually had a beach that went all the way along. So I think it's about looking at how we redesign our towns a bit. The other bit that is a bugbear for me is, and you let me have a rant here, which is great. No, but the other thing I think about is cycle lanes. We've had 20 or 30 years to work out that bikes are here and that we need to change the way we do travel. And I remember the first attempt at creating bike lanes was someone went along and painted a line along the gutter. And that was deemed a bike lane. And it really isn't. It's not adequate for people who are cycling, apart from the fact they're cycling in the gutter. It gives car drivers the impression that you actually need a very short gap between the car overtaking the cyclist and the cyclist. And you don't. You need to have a much wider space. So I think part of it is that all of our new developments should have proper cycle and pedestrian ways that encourages people to get out of their cars, that they should be connected up to a better system, a better route, if you like, for cyclists and walkers. And there are all sorts of other devices, not just cyclists. You now have these kind of single-wheel devices that you can stand on. You've got Segway things, and you've got various other things that people can be using as alternative transport to cars that get you from A to B. And if we really want to encourage that to happen, we have to actually make a conscious decision to build a proper cycling infrastructure, a proper infrastructure for people walking, using Segway type things, or I've seen people on an electric skateboard. Cool. But these are all perfectly valid ways in which people can go from A to B in short journeys. Mm-hmm. So we need to actually make a real conscious decision to change how we're set up so that we can create a proper infrastructure, starting in our towns and villages, and building it out then to connect them up in some shape or form.
I love that idea. I just want to go back. The idea that Leven Beach is actually more used than Kirkcaldy, because Kirkcaldy has nothing on that beach to attract it to the local area. There is nothing on that beach at all, apart from like the lorry parking area. Yeah, that is all they have. They have a lorry parking area and a small cafe, which is a good cafe.
Fantastic cafe, yeah.
Great cafe. We've been going for years. But again, if they were to utilise it in the same way that Leven did, like putting just like loads of things there and amusement kind of stuff.
But there isn't really an amusement thing in Kirkcaldy.
There's nothing in Kirkcaldy. There's the beach and then the lorry park.
But I mean, like, literally anywhere. I don't think there is an amusements in Kirkcaldy.
I don't know. I mean, there probably is in the high street somewhere. Or maybe no. Actually, I've not been in the high street for a while. So, there you go.
Yeah, so the reason I laughed at the dolphin thing, I think it's dolphins.
Was it dolphins were doing?
I think so. It was dolphins or whales.
I remember, it was whales, because I remember writing a bunch of statuses.
It was a big hang.
I remember writing a bunch of statuses about this with loads of swear words and big, stupid metal whales. Yeah, with swear words in between each.
But the reason I laughed at that was because we've talked about that with a couple of councillors now, and every single time that it gets brought up, they laugh.
Yeah.
So they totally dismiss the concept in full. And so now when it comes up, I just laugh. It's just an automatic thing that happens now. But yeah, I think I quite like the idea of something that has windows that are usable being in front of the beach. Because as you say, the swimming pool, you're not looking outside, you're busy swimming and stuff. So yeah, I quite like that idea.
I think it's about harnessing the natural space, but it's also about trying to look at how we do that in a way that doesn't make it tacky, doesn't make it kind of, it isn't going to be something that kind of just goes up and then declines. Yeah. We've got to look at the sustainability, because that fundamentally is the word we should be using almost in everything, is that sustainability of these things. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we know for certain is that Leven needs an economic injection. It needs something there that will make a big difference. Adding a train link will make a big difference in my view. Adding something that draws people in. I like the idea of having hovercraft. I know they tried this idea of a hovercraft between Bellow and Fife, and I got the feeling that the Edinburgh Council didn't really like it, because they said that I think they turned it down because they thought that having a hovercraft station wasn't in keeping with the local area, the planning-wise. And then you look at the Old Royal Infirmary, where they've got this wonderful old Victorian architecture, and they've stuck these big glass boxes in between, and you're going, is this the same council who have said that, well, this doesn't quite fit in, but up here in the historic part of Edinburgh, we can stick big glass boxes in amongst all this Victorian architecture, and that's fine. It just doesn't gel. But because I kind of think that the hovercraft would have attracted tourists, it would have attracted people who are going to work. If it takes you a lot less to go on a hovercraft across to Edinburgh, and you get tourists coming back because they just want to go on the hovercraft, they're going to come and they're going to buy things. Yeah. It just makes so much sense.
And hovercrafts are just cool.
My idea is to put Dodgems everywhere. Oh. You build Dodgems, the people will come. That's a famous saying.
That's laughable, but it's also
that's also good.
I think that could work. Like, you make a couple of £100 a day for the economy. That's pretty solid. That's why I'm not an economist, because my idea is Dodgems.
The other thing to look at is if you look at there are towns of kind of small towns that have established themselves as food towns. So they've created a kind of specialism around food. You get lots of people going there because of that, because they know they've got a huge amount of choice, or book towns or whatever. I mean, maybe one of the things that we should be looking at for Leven, or the Levenmouth area, or Dunfermline, or Corrie, or Burnt Island, or whatever, is actually to start to look at other specialist things that could be defined for a particular area and create something special there. And maybe, I'm not going to suggest this as a proposition, but maybe a Dodgems town would be your proposition for one of them.
Yeah. Leven, hopefully, because that's closest to us. I'm going to say that was Bruce Henderson's official idea. Vote for Bruce Henderson and you'll get Dodgems.
I've seen some car drivers who think we already are.
There you go.
So, can I ask...
sorry, you got me.
This is just a slight question for me. So, I have to be unbiased in these podcasts, and I've said that in every podcast while saying something totally not.
I love you do that every podcast. It's amazing.
But so we spoke briefly about assisted. Well, we talked about dying with dignity, but what we're talking about is assisted dying, really. So can I get a couple of answers to a couple of policy ideas of will you support assisted dying if you're elected?
I have to say I would have to think about it carefully. When Margot was talking about it, I thought about it long and hard. I think one of the reasons that people avoid it is because it is actually quite a difficult issue. I think when Margot was talking about it, she was talking about having some safeguards. It wasn't just a case of people flippantly going, today I'll just end it. It was about actually thinking it through and having a proper process involved.
Yeah.
I think on balance, people should have a right to be able to have more control over their lives, perhaps, than they do. So I think there's a part of me that thinks, yes, and I'm not in the place where someone is who maybe feels they want to have assisted dying. I think it must be a really difficult place for someone to be because it's hugely emotional, and they'd have to consider a whole number of issues, and their family would as well. So I don't think I would be able to say carte blanche, absolutely. I think if we were reaching a point where we're coming to make a decision on this, I would have to think very long and hard. I would want to talk to people just as Margot had done, and I'd want to get a real sense that this was the right thing to do. And I would want to maybe introduce it on a limited basis initially to ensure that the safeguards worked. Okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So my second question, and again, not saying which side I come down on it, would you support drug reformation, drug changing laws?
Sorry, say that again.
I've messed up the word that I was thinking of. Would you support changing drug laws so that at the very least people aren't criminalised for drug addictions? They're helped medically and things like that. Again, not saying which side I come down on, just asking.
Well, I think I probably have a fairly unique position on this because I think what we should be doing, because whenever politicians in their little bubble talk about legalising drugs, they all have a knee-jerk thing that goes, oh no, we can't do that because it's illegal. And you go, yes, that's the point why we're asking the question. What I think we should do is have a proper rationale behind it. We should create a clear criteria about what is an addictive substance that should be illegal and what's an addictive substance that shouldn't be legal. And then we should take all addictive substances, and there are a lot that are legal that might not meet the criteria to still be legal. So that's everything from tobacco products to alcohol to tea to coffee. All of these things have a level of addiction. And a lot of these things change people's mental capacity. They damage their health. And a lot of these are legal, and we know that they damage their health. We know that they kill people, but we still have them as legal. And it's historical rather than by any rationale. So I think rather than just, picking out one drug here or one thing here, I'd rather actually look at the thing as a much fuller, a much holistic, more holistic thing and say, okay, let's have that line and let's have maybe a grey area either side to have some level of flexibility, but essentially every addictive substance would then be measured against it. And the issue wouldn't then be about whether you have a specific bill to legalise marijuana. For example, marijuana has been legalised in a number of countries.
Yeah.
There are even stories of mayors of small towns whose solution to solving the financial shortfall of the town is to literally grow marijuana and make it a town, income generator. So, I'm not suggesting that Don Perman or Kirkcaldy or Leavenmouth or whatever should do that, but I think we need to actually.
Dodgems that's leaving sorted. You never need to worry about leaving again.
Definitely.
Well, listen, was about 2 or 3 years ago, there was someone on Leaven High Street who was growing cannabis, and I think it was a nice hot day, and they'd opened the window, and there was this aroma, and that's how they got caught, because someone went, that's not right. I think it was somewhere near the TSB, somewhere above it, or whatever. But, people need to be careful when they're doing stuff like that. But I think we need to have a proper rationale, a proper framework that says, actually, instead of just labelling things, let's look at the reality of each of these. And if something is legal, but it doesn't meet the criteria, we then need to phase it out and make it illegal. If something is illegal at the moment, but it passes the criteria, then what we should be doing is putting in a proper framework for it. And we shouldn't be demonising people because we don't have that rationale in place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm worried about time. Do you have time?
Okay. Yeah, I've got a wee bit of time. Yeah,
Right.
Friday afternoon.
Yeah, so I've got time, so I could ask as many questions as I like, but I wanted to make sure that you had time because I didn't want to. Because we went longer than we normally do, just by me being curious about what you think about things. So it's kind of my fault, but I normally end with a more serious, more critical. Because people listen because they like to hear political parties being criticised. So for every podcast, in order to be unbiased, again I'm using this word, I don't think I've been unbiased in a single podcast yet. I have to come up with something that's a bit more critical, or can be more critical depending on answers and things like that. So we're at that point now. So the big thing that Renew are in favour of is EU membership. So what is the actual position now? Are you still trying to rejoin the EU, or are you just campaigning because you think the EU is better? I don't know the position.
Right. I mean, there are two things here. In the short term, we're not going to be able to rejoin the EU, and we recognise that. So what we've suggested is that Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. Northern Ireland has the Northern Ireland Protocol, which Michael Gove describes as the best of both worlds. And in the short term, why shouldn't we have a Scottish protocol, where Scotland can have some more direct engagement with the EU than would otherwise be the case? In the medium term, we want to rejoin the EU. If we want to have, the reason we joined what was the EEC back in the 1970s was because we had falling fish stocks. We were known as the poor man of Europe, or the sick man of Europe, sorry, because our economy wasn't doing so well, and so on and so on. And our membership of the EEC and then the European Community and then the European Union, as it's evolved over time, and we've been part of that evolvement, has transformed our ability to trade. We have adequate fish stocks now because of the fisheries policy, and for whatever criticism we have of it, that's a fact. We've had tremendous benefits, they're educational, cultural, and so on. And Scotland's future, in our view, rests in the European Union. We believe the United Kingdom's future lies in the European Union as well. So we are unashamedly a rejoined party. What's disappointing is that Labour have now said that they are going to make Brexit work and they're no longer proposing to rejoin the EU. Conservatives are backing it no matter what. Even the Liberal Democrats have said, well, we'll just live with it. We're not. We don't see why we should, because the vote wasn't honest. We've had various prosecutions on the Leave campaign. There were votes that went missing, 1.1 million overseas postal votes. People were lied to on a massive scale, and there's no protection, and that's why we want a criminal code for politics, so that when we do have democratic events like this, that when politicians lie, they're not just going to be dealt with within the political bubble, they're actually going to face fines, debarment, and prison for being blatantly dishonest. And we need to do that because our politics has become so blatantly dishonest that people don't notice anymore. And we need to change that. So there are two things there. We need to be back in the European Union. But we also need something that ensures that politicians are actually honest, because there's no protection for voters now. There's no protection for the people at all. And we've seen that. And we see that particularly with the government that's in the UK at the moment.
Would you say that that view would be consistent with your view on Scottish independence?
Well, our view on Scottish independence is probably the most unique of all the parties, because we're not coming down in favour of the union or independence. Oh. And I know people sit there going, so what is your position? Our position is that we should stop just having those two options, because there are other options. So let's rather talk about Scotland's future. So that could be that we accelerate the decentralisation of powers. So maybe we have a big increase in the powers for the Scottish Parliament. So that's not even independence. You could have a new Act of Union, for example, not just between Scotland and England, but Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and have more equality between the four parts of the United Kingdom. You could have a Celtic Union. You could have an Isle of Man option, where the Isle of Man is an independent States, but the UK provides foreign affairs and defence for the Isle of Man. So there are a variety of other options there, and our proposition on the issue of independence, or the issue of the referendum, is that we should have a criminal code for politics in place first, so that if politicians make outlandish claims, and they did last time, they actually have to evidence their outlandish claims. Where they tell you things that are not true, they can be prosecuted for lying to the people. Second thing is that the referendum that is held should be a multiple choice referendum. So people should tell the politicians what they want, rather than the politicians telling people what they're allowed to have. At the moment, that's where we are, is people are being told you can either have the status quo or you can have independence. If you want anything else, you're not allowed it. And politicians should remember they should be working for the people, not the other way around. And the other thing we should bear in mind is, and Kenyon Wright, who chairs the Constitutional Convention, made a big point of this, and he's right. Scottish nationhood is based on the concept of we, the people. And therefore, if we are going to recognise and respect Scottish nationhood, then the people must make that decision. And finally, there should be an absolute commitment to a confirmatory referendum. We saw with Brexit what happens if you have a simple yes-no. We didn't define what Brexit was. We're not defining exactly what independence is. So I can hear the phrase, same as Brexit means Brexit as the goalpost move. You could have independence means independence, and the goalpost could be moving all the way, and politicians taking control and effectively cutting the people out. So a confirmatory referendum is absolutely essential. And that's our position, is we're not supporting either. We're saying that what we need to make sure is we have a proper process, something where the people are at the heart of it at every step, and where the politicians have an absolute obligation to be honest and to be honourable, and where the maximum choice is given to people, and the people tell the politicians what they want, and the politicians then are obliged to pursue what people want rather than what politicians want.
I'll be honest, you've kind of ruined my critical thing. So what's happened is, because we're interviewing so many people, I've got your policy mixed up with somebody else's policy. And when you started speaking, I was like, oh shit, that's totally the wrong policy. So I've no got a critical question for you. What I was expecting you to say is that the referendum was done and that was it, and you're going to respect democracy. After you had said that there were lies told in the EU referendum, and that was going to be my thing, until I realised that you were the wrong political party, and so I didn't have that question anymore. Amazing. So thanks for ruining my question.
Oh, you ruined it.
That's okay.
Bruce ruined it.
What I would say is that I believe, and Renew Scotland as a group believes, that there is an absolute case for a new referendum. Because if you look at 2014, what was on offer was remaining within the UK and within the EU. And people like David Cameron said the best way of remaining in the EU was to remain in the UK. So the package was in the UK, in the EU. So that referendum result is dead. That is not being respected. In the EU referendum, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain within the EU. And that's not being respected. So there are huge changes that have happened since 2014 in particular. And what people voted for is not what is here. So there is an absolute case for another referendum, and we absolutely agree. But we want the safeguards. We want the safeguard of our criminal code. We want the safeguard of a multiple choice referendum, and we want the safeguard of a confirmatory referendum. And I think that is a good process, and it's a way of showing that actually we can do referendum properly, where the people are at the heart of it all the way.
Perfect.
Cool. Okay, so we've reached...
I apologise.
Oh. Sorry, what were you saying?
I'm saying I apologise for being the wrong party.
Yeah, it's all right. That was my bad.
Right, so we've reached the final segment of the show. This is about where we put you on the spot for just a couple of minutes. One of my biggest pet hates in life is watching people at hustings and different radio shows, and they're usually given like 3 minutes to solve terrorism or something like that can't be solved in those sort of 3 minute segments. But what I do like is the panic it causes. I'm a bit of a sadist, and I do enjoy that. So what I'm going to do now, Bruce, is I'm going to give you 2 minutes for you to tell the people why they should vote for you. And we're going to start 3, 2, 1, go.
Well, I think there are 4 key areas that are very important to me and to Renew Scotland. The first is we want to end poverty, and we've talked about that already. The difference it would make to people's lives is enormous. It would change communities and it would change our economy. We want to have honest politics, so a criminal code for politicians, so that they actually have an obligation to be honest or face fines, debarment, or even prison. Take it out of the bubble and let them live in the real world. We want to have greater accountability, and something we didn't touch on. The Scottish Parliament, when we're elected, 42% of the MSPs will be accountable to the party only. So they don't have constituents as such. I will be on the list. I'll take that, being an MSP seriously. But they're accountable to the party. There are a lot of MSPs that step down during the Parliament, and new MSPs suddenly emerge from the list that the party has appointed, not the people. So we need to change that. We need to have more information on what politicians are actually doing. We need to look at how we rejoin the EU or how we engage with the EU through maybe a Scottish protocol. But we also then need to look at how we look at Scotland's future. And it should be about Scotland's future, not just about independence versus the Union. It should actually be about what kind of Scotland we want. Let's look at the Scotland we want and then design the constitutional arrangement around the future of our country, rather than have a constitutional change and then design Scotland around the constitutional change. Future Scotland that's actually important. It's not independence or the Union. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. As me as an individual, I've come into politics not to be a career politician. I want to affect change. I'm fed up with the way politicians operate. Is that it?
Sorry, there's 2 minutes here, but you keep going, that's fine.
Well, I'm just fed up with the way that politicians have operated throughout my entire life. I've seen politicians talk about all sorts of things, and they don't do it. Mm-hmm. They don't affect the change that they promise. And I think it's time that we take the politicians out of their bubble. I think it's time we burst it. I think it's time we change things. And I want to be one of the people that helps to make that happen.
Perfect. There you go.
I'm disappointed.
What?
At 0 point during that 2 minutes, 2 minutes and whatever, did I hear about Dodgems and weed?
Listen, well, I do Santa Claus at Christmas, which I absolutely adore. And one of the things I say to kids is, now, just remember, you need to be sound asleep when I come, because, as you know, if you're awake and you start talking to Santa, Santa will gab. And as you can see, Santa gabs an awful lot. And therefore, other children will miss out, and that wouldn't be fair now, would it? So yes, I probably speak far too much.
Well, we'll have to clarify that Bruce is a fake Santa. The real Santa was on our podcast in December, and that was definitely the real Santa, so Bruce can't be the real Santa. So we're just clarifying that.
I help out the gentleman in the red suit.
Yes.
And it is actually one of my favourite points in the year, because it's just, you have amazing conversations, and kids are just so amazing. And they tell Santa things. I mean, the parents are there, and it's fine, but they tell Santa things that they wouldn't normally tell. They don't have that conversation with their parents, and they just have a conversation with Santa.
How was it this year, being social distancing?
It was very different this year because most of the corporate stuff fell, and I quite enjoyed it. But I did a lot more visits to houses, mainly around Fife and Dunfermline, in fact. And when we say house visits, essentially it was doorsteps. So
Oh, you
what
done
I
that
asked people
stuff?
to do was, pardon?
I'm sorry, I was just happy that you done that stuff.
I mean, I've been doing this for a few years, and I genuinely love it. I mean, if I hadn't been doing Santa this year, I would have been genuinely disheartened.
Yeah.
Really, it was a huge. It's one of those things that it gives me a real boost at the end of the year to go and have these conversations. I'm a very good Santa, by the way, for the record. But but this year was a lot more just a lot more kind of smaller groups of kids and so on. But it was all properly, with a face mask, and I had a separate pair of gloves for each visit, and I did the hand wash in between the stuff that you put in your hand. So it was all very COVID friendly, as it were. But it was good. I enjoyed it this year. A bit different to the norm.
Do you put the mask over your beard or under the beard?
The mask went over the beard.
Okay.
And it was a special Christmas mask. So it wasn't. It had reindeer and stuff on it and so on. So it was all still very Christmassy. And the kids were quite fine with that. And I still got some great requests for gifts and things. But I also talked to them about things like the Tidy Fairy, which some kids kind of aren't so keen on. So then I have to go and tidy the room.
Can I just get you to confirm, Craig? You asked if you put the mask under the beard and therefore ruining the illusion that it's a real beard.
But then the kids wouldn't have known that it's under the beard because it's under the beard.
I think they would.
Nah.
They would just notice like a mouthless face, like from under the.
Oh, aye,
it would look weird. They would ruin the completely.
Yeah. Well, he's far away from them. They wouldn't. Wouldn't see?
You have to just paint a mouth on the mask.
There you go.
Don't underestimate. Children are actually very sharp and very clear. But ultimately, when you're doing something like Santa, it's a performance. I've been doing acting for a number of years. It's something I enjoy in filmmaking. And when you're doing something at Santa, it's the performance that counts. I did a gig in Glasgow a number of years, 3 or 4 years ago, and by the time I got there, I realised I'd left the hat. So I thought I can't drive all the way back and get the hat. So I did the gig without the hat, and only one child actually asked about the hat. I was warm in here, so I thought I'd leave the hat on, and they were quite fine with that. So it all comes down to the performance. You need to kind of. I believe that there's a kind of magic that every child should feel they've actually talked to Santa, and I think that's really important that they feel that.
That's why we got the real Santa Claus on the podcast. He was not a councillor in the local area.
Shh.
He was
unbelievable, Craig.
He was the real Santa Claus.
Yes, he was. I think that's perfect way to end there.
Yeah.
Right,
so
Bruce.
I think we've got everything. Is there anything else you feel like you need to talk about? Is there anything else?
Well, there's one thing I would actually like to talk about. I've been involved in filmmaking for the last 15 years, and I think one of the things that I'm very clear about is we have some amazingly talented people in Scotland, but we have very few facilities. The government's approach is to have a big mega studio in Edinburgh. I think the weakness of that is that we have filmmakers in Inverness, we have filmmakers across Fife, we have filmmakers all over the country. And I think the bit that's missing from that strategy is 5 or 6 micro-budget film studios dotted around Scotland to bring filmmakers together, give them proper facility that's not hugely expensive, but that allows them to actually make more ambitious films. Mm-hmm. And that, I believe, would make a big difference towards actually having a Scottish film industry and not having a Scottish film industry. So that's something I'm quite passionate about. And if I'm elected, that's one of the things I would certainly push is to develop that kind of infrastructure.
Awesome. There you go. Well, I think that's about it. You got any more, Craig, that you need to add in? No? You cool? Well, Bruce, we can let you go now. We've kept you up like way beyond your time.
I think this is the longest podcast we've done for the politics thing.
Yeah.
I talk too much.
Well, I kept asking questions that I didn't normally ask, and also I got the party wrong. So that was
that was
my
an extra
fault.
question that you've messed up.
Yeah, I messed up. Yeah,
Amazing. All right. So
it's
Bruce,
not a professional podcast. It's fine.
yeah.